March 24, 1945. The Rhine lay behind Allied lines at last, yet the war inside the Allied command was reaching its most dangerous moment. The guns along the Western Front thundered with a confidence not heard in years. Germany was collapsing. The Allies stood on the threshold of final victory. And yet, in the quiet rooms where maps were spread and decisions weighed, a different kind of battle was being fought, one of egos, pride, and command. At its center stood two men who had carried the weight of the war in Europe on their shoulders. One was General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, calm, political, and relentlessly focused on unity. The other was Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, brilliant, meticulous, and impossible to ignore. This was the day Eisenhower came closer than ever to removing Montgomery from the war. The story did not begin on the banks of the Rhine. It began years earlier, in the deserts of North Africa, where Montgomery first rose to fame under the burning sun of El Alamein. There, in October 1942, Montgomery had done what many believed impossible. He halted and then shattered the Afrika Korps. British morale surged. Montgomery became a symbol, not just of victory, but of methodical, deliberate warfare. He promised his men they would win, and then he did. But even in triumph, Montgomery revealed the traits that would later bring him into conflict. He was supremely confident, openly critical of others, and deeply convinced that only his way could bring success. Eisenhower watched from a distance at first. As Supreme Commander, he valued results, but he valued unity even more. Montgomery's victories were welcomed. His personality was tolerated. For a time, their differences were manageable. The invasion of Normandy in June 1944 changed everything. Operation Overlord was the greatest amphibious assault in history, and Montgomery played a central role. He commanded all ground forces during the initial phase. The plan bore his imprint: secure the beaches, draw German armor toward the British sector, and allow American forces to break out elsewhere. On paper, it made sense. On the ground, it became a grinding nightmare. The hedgerows of Normandy slowed the advance to a crawl. Casualties mounted. Progress fell behind schedule. Montgomery insisted this was all according to plan. Critics were unconvinced. American generals, particularly George S. Patton and Omar Bradley, began to bristle. They believed Montgomery was cautious to a fault, slow where speed was essential. Montgomery, for his part, believed the Americans were reckless. Eisenhower stood between them, absorbing complaints, smoothing tensions, refusing to take sides publicly. But privately, doubts began to grow. By August 1944, the Allies broke free from Normandy and raced across France. Paris fell. German forces retreated in disarray. Momentum favored bold action. Montgomery saw an opportunity. He proposed a single, decisive thrust into Germany, one narrow spearhead across the Rhine, aimed straight at the Ruhr. If successful, the war could be ended by Christmas. This plan became Operation Market Garden. Eisenhower hesitated. The plan was risky, dependent on precise timing and optimistic intelligence. But Montgomery argued relentlessly. He promised success. He dismissed concerns. Against his better judgment, Eisenhower approved it. The result was disaster. In September 1944, Allied paratroopers dropped deep behind enemy lines in the Netherlands. Bridges had to be captured intact. Ground forces had to advance rapidly to relieve them. They did not. German resistance stiffened. Intelligence failures mounted. At Arnhem, British airborne troops were surrounded. Relief came too late. Over 1,400 British soldiers were killed. Thousands more were captured. The bridge at Arnhem became known as a bridge too far. The shockwaves rippled through Allied command. Montgomery publicly defended the operation, calling it 90% successful. Eisenhower listened in silence. Inside his headquarters, the atmosphere had changed. Winter arrived, and with it came the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge erupted in December 1944, catching American forces by surprise. German armor punched deep into Allied lines. Panic spread. Eisenhower acted decisively. He shifted reserves, stabilized the front, and prevented catastrophe. Montgomery, whose forces were largely untouched, was given temporary command of American units north of the Bulge. It was a practical decision, but one that carried enormous political risk. Montgomery did his job well. He held the line. Then he spoke. At a press conference, Montgomery implied that American forces had been rescued by British leadership. He spoke of panic and chaos before his arrival. American commanders were furious. Patton exploded. Bradley nearly resigned. The sense of insult ran deep. Eisenhower was forced to issue a formal apology on Montgomery's behalf. The damage was done. By early 1945, Germany was bleeding from every direction. Soviet armies closed in from the east. In the west, Allied forces pressed toward the Rhine. The question was no longer whether Germany would fall, but how, and under whose direction. Montgomery still argued for a single thrust. Eisenhower had decided otherwise. The Supreme Commander now favored a broad-front strategy, multiple armies advancing together, denying the Germans any chance to regroup. It was slower but safer. Montgomery saw it as a betrayal of boldness. He did not hide his displeasure. In briefings, in memos, and in conversations, Montgomery challenged Eisenhower's decisions. He bypassed normal channels, appealing directly to political leaders in London. Eisenhower noticed, and this time, he did not ignore it. The breaking point came in March 1945. Allied forces were preparing to cross the Rhine, the final natural barrier before the heart of Germany. The operation required absolute coordination. Montgomery demanded priority for his forces in the north. He wanted resources, air support, and headlines. Eisenhower had already authorized multiple crossings elsewhere. Montgomery objected loudly. He accused Eisenhower of lacking vision. He implied that the Supreme Commander was bowing to American pressure. The language, though careful, was unmistakable. Eisenhower had reached his limit. In a private meeting with his senior staff, he spoke words few had ever heard from him. If Montgomery cannot operate within the framework of Allied command, Eisenhower said, then I will have to consider removing him. The room fell silent. Removing Montgomery would be unprecedented. He was Britain's most famous general, Churchill's protege, a national hero. But Eisenhower meant it. Behind closed doors, Eisenhower drafted a message to the British chiefs of staff. It outlined Montgomery's repeated insubordination, his public statements, his refusal to accept strategic decisions. The implication was clear. Montgomery was becoming a liability. The message was never sent. At the last moment, Eisenhower paused. He understood the consequences. Removing Montgomery could fracture the alliance at the moment of victory. It could inflame British public opinion. It could give Stalin leverage. Unity mattered more than satisfaction. Eisenhower chose restraint. But the relationship was broken. Montgomery crossed the Rhine days later under Operation Plunder. It was a massive, carefully staged assault. The river was forced. German resistance crumbled. Montgomery claimed vindication. Eisenhower did not respond. From that point on, Montgomery was sidelined. His influence diminished. Decisions were made without him. His vision of a single thrust was abandoned entirely. The war ended weeks later. Germany surrendered on May 7, 1945. Victory belonged to all. But the scars remained. In the years after the war, Montgomery wrote memoirs. He defended his actions. He criticized others. He never admitted fault. Eisenhower became President of the United States. He spoke rarely of Montgomery. When he did, his words were measured. He was a great soldier, Eisenhower once said, but a difficult ally. The day Eisenhower almost removed Montgomery from the war never appeared in official communiques. It existed only in memoranda, in memories, and in the tension that once threatened to fracture the alliance that defeated Nazi Germany. It was a reminder that wars are not won by weapons alone, but by the fragile cooperation of men who must set aside pride for something greater. And on that day in March 1945, the fate of that cooperation hung by a thread.